Between mainland North Carolina and the narrow stretch of barrier islands we call the Outer Banks sits a tiny island, just 12 miles long and around 3 miles wide. Dotted with rich maritime forest and bordered by brackish salt marsh on all sides, it's home to two sleepy towns aptly named Manteo and Wanchese. This is Roanoke Island, of course, of lost colony fame. But some 300 years later, in the mid 1800s, it was home to another colony entirely, one you've probably never even heard of. A colony whose population soared to just under 4,000 people in a matter of a few years. That's more than the combined populations of Manteo and Wanchese today. This was the Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony, and its history, its story, some might argue, has become even more lost than the lost colony itself. Let's fix that. Hello, I'm Shay LaFontaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I discuss lesser-known true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. I'm very, very excited to be joined this week by a descendant of the Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony to help me tell this story.
My name is Joan Collins. I am a board member with the Pea Island Preservation Society, Inc. We're also called PIPSI, the Pea Island Preservation Society, Inc., but we're a nonprofit organization located on Roanoke Island, and our mission is to promote the history of Keeper Richard Etheridge and the Pea Island Lifesavers, a history that's also connected to the story of the enslaved, the story of the Freedmen's Colony on Roanoke Island.
But Joan is more than just a preservationist.
Well, actually, my descendants were at the Freedmen's Colony. Although I did not grow up and live on Roanoke Island as a young person, um, I have a deep roots to this area.
Before we get into the colony itself, there's a whole backstory I need to fill you in on. Some context. Our story begins in 1861, not at all coincidentally the same year the American Civil War began. So the southern states, including North Carolina, have seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America. The southern states are protecting their own interests. They want slavery. They need slavery because their economy is mostly built on agriculture. And if you have to actually pay people to work on your plantations, you can't make nearly as much money. In the North, they have factories and industry, manufacturing, not plantations. So slavery isn't as big of a deal up there. And in fact, many people in the northern states have come to understandably despise the institution. These abolitionists want to put an end to slavery, and the southern states see this as a threat. Yes, there are other factors at play that led to the southern states seceding from the Union. Everyone loves to remind me of this. But it is safe to say that slavery was the spark. It was the catalyst, the straw that broke the camel's back. The Civil War officially began in April of 1861, when Confederate troops captured Fort Sumter, which was like a Union post near Charleston, South Carolina. Now, here's the problem for the South in this war. They don't have a lot of stuff. They don't have guns and ammunition. They have cotton and tobacco, and you can't win a war with cotton and tobacco. The North makes stuff in their factories. They make guns and ammunition and cannons and uniforms and helmets and boots. All of it. They make it. They have it. The South doesn't. The way the South gets things that they need is by selling their crops. They sell their cotton and they use the money to buy these things. They trade for it, essentially. So when the war starts, the most obvious way for the North to win is to block this trade. They obviously aren't going to be selling any guns to the South themselves. They're going to have to get the guns from somewhere else, mostly Europe. So the southern states pack their cotton and tobacco onto ships, and they take it to Europe, where they turn it into guns and ammunition and boots, etc. If the Union forces can stop this trade, this exchange from happening, then the Confederacy is screwed, right? They're outgunned. And that's exactly what the North does. They set up blockades to stop Southern ships from being able to trade. But the South has to try. They send blockade runners to sneak past the Union blockades and make this very important trade happen. This is Rhett Butler from Gone with the Wind, right? He was a blockade runner. Now, Wilmington, North Carolina is the main blockade running port for the state. So if you can get your goods to Wilmington, you stand a chance of being able to trade them. But between all of these big agricultural towns, New Bern, Plymouth, Edenton, Elizabeth City, between them and Wilmington, and between major Confederate cities like Richmond and Norfolk, Virginia, and Wilmington, are sounds, bodies of brackish water, 4 of them, 4 sounds. The Pamlico Sound, the Albemarle Sound, the Croatan Sound, and the Roanoke Sound. And smack dab in the middle of those 4 sounds sits Roanoke Island. It's the back door to all of it. If the Union can control Roanoke Island, they will control all of coastal North Carolina. Because there are very few ways out of these sounds. You're blocked in by the barrier islands, and there's only a handful of ways out. Oregon Inlet is a big one. Controlling Roanoke Island means controlling Oregon Inlet. Hatteras Inlet is another big one. So first, the Union goes after Hatteras. In August of 1861, about 4 months after the start of the war, Union Army General Benjamin Butler joined forces with Navy Commodore Silas Stringham to take over a couple of pretty shoddy sand forts that the Confederacy had set up on Hatteras Island. So we have the Army and the Navy both involved here because this is what's called an amphibious attack. You have to be able to fight by water and by land. But honestly, they don't even have to fight to take Hatteras. They just kind of show up and take it. It's not well manned. And when word reached Norfolk that Union forces were going after Hatteras, the Confederacy hastily sent reinforcements to help hold the forts on the island, but they fell well before the regiment arrived. So they get there and they're like, well, shoot, they got it. But instead of heading back to Norfolk, they go set up shop on Roanoke Island. If the Union is after inlets, it won't be long before they set their sights on Roanoke. In all, there were around 1,400 Confederate troops. But according to author and historian William R. Trotter in his book Ironclads and Columbiads, the number available for duty was smaller than that because the living conditions put as many as 1/4 of the command on the sick list. So yeah, the Confederates are struggling on Roanoke Island. They are poorly clothed and super under-equipped. Most of them are using their own shotguns they brought from home, not even like legit military-issued guns. Henry A. Wise was put in charge of these troops, and although he begged Norfolk for more guns, they were like, nah, y'all are good. But they weren't good, and I think this was like a major oversight. I don't think the Confederacy realized how valuable Roanoke Island really was. Or maybe they did, and they just didn't have the equipment to equip them with. Maybe they would have sent more guns if they had had them. They were more focused on protecting Richmond, the capital. They were like, Roanoke who? But with what little they have, Wise sets up some forts to defend the island. They have 37 cannons, and they spread them around to man these makeshift forts, with almost all of them focused on the Croatan Sound, which is on the back side of Roanoke Island, the western side, between the island and the mainland. Now, unfortunately for the Confederacy, they do almost nothing to protect entrance from the Pamlico Sound to the south, which is where the Union will ultimately approach from. Wise knows this is a measly attempt at defense. He knows they're screwed if the Union tries to take the island. He sinks a few ships in the Sound, hoping to make it impassable. And the Confederate Navy under Flag Officer William F. Lynch cobbles together 7 gunboats that will come to be called the Mosquito Fleet to help defend from the water. But Wise disagrees with this strategy because these ineffective gunboats took guns, and by guns I mean cannons, from the forts, and they also took men from the forts, and they also just needed the boats to be used as boats. Wise wrote, quote, Captain Lynch was energetic, zealous, and active, but he gave too much consequence entirely to his fleet of gunboats, which hindered transportation of piles, lumber, forage, supplies of all kinds, and of troops by taking away the steam tugs and converting them into perfectly imbecile gunboats, end quote. So the Confederate troops on Roanoke Island were a hot mess, scrambling around, trying to work with what they had, which was almost nothing. Meanwhile, the Union is planning another amphibious attack. This one led by Navy Flag Officer Lewis M. Goldsborough and Army Brigadier General Ambrose Burnside. This would come to be called the Burnside Expedition. In contrast to the 37-gun disaster that's happening over on Roanoke Island, the Union had 108 pieces of artillery aboard their ships when they set out from Annapolis, Maryland in January of 1862. The Army guys meet up with the Navy guys near the Chesapeake Bay. And at this point, which this is kind of crazy to me, but up until this point, only Burnside and his immediate staff, like his inner circle, knew their destination. And this isn't like a couple of guys. We're talking about 13,000 men and over 80 ships. And the captains of those ships had no idea where they were going. Once at sea, the captain of each ship opened sealed orders that revealed that they needed to go towards Cape Hatteras. And you guys, Hatteras, the village of Hatteras today has a population of 458 people. So imagining 13,000 Union troops on their way to Hatteras is pretty wild. Now, let me remind you, this stretch of the Atlantic off the Outer Banks is known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic for a reason. And it lives up to its name during this expedition. The weather does not cooperate. They're dealing with nor'easters, rough seas. Many of the men are seasick, and 3 of the ships sink. The City of New York, which was full of supplies, Pocahontas, which was full of horses, and a gunboat called Zouave. But all the men are rescued from these ships and crowd onto the other ships. The horses were not as lucky, sadly. They need to pass through Hatteras Inlet and into the Pamlico Sound in order to make their way up to Roanoke Island. The problem is their ships draw 8 feet of water, and they were under the impression that the inlet was 8 feet deep, but they find that it is actually only 6 feet deep. This is the same exact problem the Roanoke colonies ran into. The sound, the inlets, who knows how deep they are? They change constantly as sand is washed around, and they're quite often impassable for larger vessels like this. So for the Burnside expedition, this meant leaving most of their supplies on Hatteras Island to lighten the ships enough to pass through into the Sound. Some of the ships couldn't make it through even after lightening their loads, so 3 full regiments of men were left behind in Hatteras. One turned around and went back to Annapolis altogether, and the rest were crowded onto already overcrowded ships. They make their way through the inlet and up the Pamlico Sound to Stumpy Point, which is southwest of Roanoke Island, like on the mainland, across the Sound from the island. Here, Burnside encounters some formerly enslaved freedom seekers who had escaped from North Carolina plantations, and they inform him of the Confederacy's sorry situation on Roanoke Island. They know where the forts are, and more importantly, they know where the forts are not. And this was a little surprising to me. You think about these enslaved people as working on plantations and being sort of landlocked and working the land. But in this case, they're like these master navigators who know the waterways and they know what's happening across the Sound, and they're very familiar with the area, and they're acting almost as guides. And Joan actually brought this up in our interview.
Well, first of all, people, also I find have this, kind of classic image of the enslaved. They don't view the enslaved necessarily as people who lived on the coast all of their lives, as people who were the expert watermen. They're people who are used to living in this environment. I think if you study Civil War history, you will see how even the enslaved, were allowed to leave their plantations sometimes because they were the ones that guided people through these waterways. And, so they very much had roles that, I think people don't necessarily think enough about.
So they know the location of these forts and they know how to approach Roanoke Island. They know where the water is deep, they know where the water is shallow, and they tell this information to Burnside and his men. The Roanoke Sound to the east is too shallow. They have to approach the island from the west, which is why most of the Confederate forts face the Croatan Sound west of the island. But with this intel that Burnside gets, he sees an opening on the south side of the island through Captain William Ashby's farm. And this is where they make landfall, bombarding the Confederate defenses and making their way ashore to camp for the night. Now, once they're ashore, the Confederacy is kind of screwed. Almost all of their defenses were positioned to hold off the Union in the water. Now that they've made landfall, all the Confederacy has left is this measly little earthenwork mound in the center of the island with 3 cannons on it. Here's how the National Park Service describes it. Quote, "This battery, sitting astride the road, was 35 yards wide with a water-filled ditch 8 feet wide and 3 feet deep guarding the front. Supporting the 3 guns were about 1,000 poorly armed soldiers from various regiments. The field in front of the battery was 700 feet long by 300 feet wide and surrounded by marshy swamps. It was these pools of black, slimy, swampy ground that the Confederates put their faith in. They expected the Union force to funnel their attack down the roadway, as the swamps were too treacherous and impassable. They were proven wrong." End quote. So yeah, they were not deterred by the swamps. They hopped right in the swamp and approached from all angles, easily taking this last stronghold on February 8th, 1862. Which, get this, I'm researching and writing this episode on February 8th. Did not plan that. Had no idea when the Battle of Roanoke Island took place. Could have been July, for all I knew. I had a 1 in 365 chance of that happening. So that one really blew me away. And I know I've mentioned this before, you guys, but this has happened so many times in the making of this podcast. It's really wild, these little serendipitous coincidences. And I take it as a sign that I'm on the right track, that I'm supposed to be doing this, a little validation from the universe. There really weren't very many casualties in the Battle of Roanoke Island. Once again, the Union just kind of showed up and took it. The Confederate troops at that little 3-gun mound retreated pretty much immediately back to their camp and then surrendered. They were so outnumbered and so outgunned, there was just no point in fighting. It would be an unnecessary loss of life. According to the National Park Service, quote, "Roanoke Island was captured by Burnside at a very modest cost in casualties to his men. Official Union losses were given as 37 killed, 214 wounded, and 13 missing. Confederate losses were only 22 killed and 58 wounded. However, 2,500 Confederate soldiers surrendered." End quote. Now, this may not seem like a big deal. This is a tiny island in the middle of the Sound. How important could it possibly be? And perhaps that's why the Confederacy sort of overlooked it, failed to properly man and gun it. But it was actually a huge victory for the Union Army. The National Park Service says, quote, "On a military front, the capture of Roanoke Island opened up the interior riverline port cities such as Plymouth and New Bern to direct invasion, as well as to threaten Morehead City, North Carolina, and Norfolk, Virginia, from their weaker rear areas. By the summer of 1862, all of the above cities had fallen to Union forces and seriously threatened the vital rail line from the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia, to its only East Coast blockade running port in Wilmington, North Carolina. With the huge success at Roanoke Island, the Union stranglehold on the South was ever tightening." End quote. So, with Roanoke Island now under Union control and the 2,500 Confederate soldiers who surrendered likely becoming prisoners of war, there was a third group on the island. Around 250 enslaved African Americans who had been sent by their enslavers to help build the Confederate forts on the island. General Burnside declares them contraband, and they become the property of the Union Army, same as the guns and whatever else they took from Confederate soldiers. But the Union has no interest in continuing to enslave them. That's part of what they're fighting for, right? An end to slavery. So they emancipated them, gave them their freedom, and many of them went to work for the Union troops now controlling the area. They went to work rebuilding the forts on Roanoke and Hatteras Islands, as well as New Bern, which had fallen soon after Roanoke. According to the National Park Service, quote, they also worked as cooks, woodcutters, teamsters, longshoremen, carpenters, and blacksmiths. Women were employed in doing tasks such as cooking and cleaning for Union officers. Other African Americans, more courageous than most, were employed as spies, scouts, and guides, and completed many invaluable missions for the Union. End quote. And they're no longer enslaved, remember, so they are actually being paid for this work.
The Roanoke Island, I mean, just think of how people traveled during those days, the seaports and the trade that's happening and just, kind of traveling up and down the coast. So when the Union troops pushed into Roanoke Island, the Confederate troops and the slave owning farmers, uh, they left. So now you have free blacks that are taken in by the Union soldiers, who gave them food, helped them build shelters.
Word spread rather quickly that Roanoke Island had become a sort of safe haven for freedom seekers. And those 200 some Black people on the island after the battle, that number rose quickly to around 1,000 by the end of 1862. They are flocking to the island from surrounding areas because they know if they can just get there to where those Union soldiers are camping out, they will be free.
As more and more freed blacks arrived looking for safety and assurance, the word spread. As a matter of fact, there's a church that's connected to also to my family history called Haven Creek Baptist Church on Roanoke Island. And that name is derived, because of the phrase, if you cross the creek, which was really the sound. If you cross the creek, you'll reach a safe haven.
So, freedom seekers from across the Sound or Creek were crossing over to make their way to Roanoke Island. Many of these people would have traveled from plantations on the mainland. One of the biggest was Somerset Plantation. And this got me thinking because, I've visited Somerset. It's not too far from here. And I know that the family that owned that plantation had the last name Collins, just like Joan. So it got me wondering if Joan's ancestors may have once been enslaved at Somerset Plantation. I have to ask. So I know the family that owned Somerset Place over in Crestwell. Their last name was Collins. Is that
Right.
where your
Yeah,
ancestors were?
I truly believe so, although I can't say that I have heard or I have seen a document to that effect. But, in talking about my grandfather was a man named Marshall Collins, and he married someone named a Berry, Gussie Berry. But anyway, my father never knew for certain where his father was born, but he always speculated it was near the Somerset plantation. And if you know the history of the Somerset plantation, which is about, I guess, about an hour's drive from here on Roanoke Island. And interesting you raised this because I was just there about maybe a month or so ago for the second time only. And it always brings up, interesting emotions for me. But anyway, if you know the history of this at Somerset Plantation, and the name Collins. That is a name that is also a very well known name associated with people who were enslaved, and those people, could be, people that like my family that had Native American ties. They could be, people that in their day, may have been known as mulatto. People that the Collins plantation owners not only own Somerset, but they own several plantations in this area. And when you dig and dig and dig, it just makes sense, at least to me, that that's where my name derives. It's always a journey, but yeah, I do believe my last name derives from Hosea Collins, and that's three generations of slave owners that were at the Somerset plantation.
So they arrive, these freedom seekers, they arrive on Roanoke Island and they build churches and schools and they start converting the old Confederate Army barracks into housing and they build houses and a community of freedmen starts to blossom.
So the Freedmen's Colony is where, actually almost 4,000, I mean, imagine it, think about it. If you know Roanoke Island, which you obviously do, it's not very large island, but it's where some almost 4,000 men, women, and children, ultimately come seeking freedom, safety, and a better life. So they were given small portions of land, to build houses, to grow crops, schools, one of the churches were built, churches obviously being one of the first things that were built. Just kind of think of how they must have felt, for the very first time getting a taste of freedom.
In January of 1863, in the thick of the war, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, liberating all of the enslaved people in the Confederate States, which I just love so much because, okay, they seceded from the Union. According to them, they're no longer part of the United States. Abraham Lincoln is not their president. They have their own president. I love that he's still exerting power over them despite all that. He just completely disregarded the whole secession thing. It's the most insulting thing ever, and I love it. So, according to the US government, slavery is donezo. And when this happens, they start to get serious about the fledgling freedmen's colony forming on Roanoke Island. This is no longer a temporary situation. These people are free forever. They are no longer enslaved. And so they start to try to help them set up for this new life of freedom. The government obtains a large tract of land from local landowners for the colony. An abolitionist army chaplain named Horace James is put in charge as, quote, superintendent of Negro affairs for the North Carolina district, end quote. So it's his job to try to set up this sustainable freedmen's colony on Roanoke Island and also in New Bern. He's actually based in New Bern, and he's working on another colony there too. So he's honestly spread a bit thin. They build more churches, they build more schools, they build hundreds of houses, 561 houses by 1865. Teachers are brought in from the north to teach the people how to read and write. They set up a sawmill. They give them tools for farming, and more people are flocking to the island. By 1865, the population of the colony had increased to 3,901 people. Another thing that happened after the Emancipation Proclamation was Black people were allowed to join the Union Army, which they legally could not do before that. And when that happened, around 150 men from the Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony joined the Army to fight for the Union. Now, considering only around 4,000 Black men in all of North Carolina joined the Army, 150 from this one tiny island alone is a lot. And it actually had some repercussions for the colony. This was the majority of the physically able men in the colony. Because even with 3,000 some people, roughly half of them were younger than 14 years old. Many were women, many were elderly, and when those physically able men went off to join the army, it left the colony less self sufficient and more reliant on government rations to survive. I mean, it already kind of was because Roanoke Island doesn't have great soil for growing crops. There's no way they're sustaining 4,000 people with crops grown on Roanoke Island. Another problem the lost colonists faced, right? Acquiring food. It's a problem because resources are very limited on a 12-mile by 3-mile island. Even the indigenous people who were living on Roanoke Island back in the 1500s knew this. It wasn't like a permanent residence. It was like an outpost of their larger village on the mainland, Dasamankapieck, which is today Man's Harbor. Because Roanoke Island, it didn't have good soil to sustain large numbers of people. And this is a problem for the Freedmen's colony as well. And when those men went off to war, it really left the rest of them in a tough spot. Government rations start to dwindle towards the end of the war, and people are hungry. On top of that, infectious disease is ravaging them, and this is likely exacerbated by hunger and malnutrition. But they're also just living in tight quarters with no infrastructure to handle sanitation. And this is the 1860s. They don't even know how this stuff spreads. So diseases like smallpox, cholera, and dysentery start tearing through the colony. Horace James, who remember was that army chaplain, abolitionist guy who was sort of put in charge as like the patriarch of this colony to make it happen, he's honestly glorified a little bit, I think, in most of the sources that I read. They talk about how he took a special interest in the colony and thought it could be this great example of how formerly enslaved people could be assimilated into American society. And that's all well and good, but I don't think he actually did a whole lot to help them when things started to take a turn. He was in New Bern, after all. He wasn't even there. And he had put other guys in charge, and I don't think they were doing a very good job. And I based that on a letter that I found that was written by a Black man named Richard Etheridge. Now, you've already heard Joan mention Richard Etheridge, and you will hear that name again. Hint, hint, to next week's episode. But this letter was written by Richard Etheridge to Major General Oliver O. Howard, the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau. Richard Etheridge was kind of a special case as far as being a Black man on Roanoke Island in the 1860s. He was believed to have been the son of his enslaver, and although he was enslaved by his own father, potentially, John B. Etheridge, he was actually raised as a part of the Etheridge household, and he was educated. He could read and write. So here in this letter, we see him advocating for the colony, most of whom were just beginning to learn to read and write as adults. Etheridge writes, quote, "General, we the soldiers of the 36th U.S. Colored Regiment humbly petition you to alter the affairs at Roanoke Island. We have served in the U.S. Army faithfully and done our duty to our country, for which we thank God that we had the opportunity. But at the same time, our families are suffering at Roanoke Island, North Carolina. 1. When we were enlisted in the service, we were promised that our wives and families should receive rations from government. The rations for our wives and families have been and are now cut down to half the regular ration. Consequently, 3 or 4 days out of every 10 days, they have nothing to eat. At the same time, our rations are stolen from the ration house by Mr. Streeter, the assistant superintendent at the island, and others, and sold while our families are suffering for something to eat. Second, Mr. Holland Streeter, the assistant superintendent of Negro affairs at Roanoke Island, is a thrower Cooper head a man, and I don't know what that means, but that's what the letter says, who says that he is no part of an abolitionist, takes no care of the colored people, and has no sympathy with the colored people. A man who kicks our wives and children out of the ration house or commissary. He takes no notice of their actual suffering and sells the rations and allows it to be sold, and our families suffer for something to eat. Third, Captain Horace James, the superintendent in charge, has been told of these facts and has taken no notice of them. So has Colonel Lehman, the commander in charge of Roanoke, but no notice is taken of it because it comes from contrabands or freedmen. The cause of much suffering is that Captain James has not paid the colored people for their work for near a year, and at the same time cuts the rations off to one half so the people have neither provisions or money to buy it with. There are men on the island that have been wounded at Dutch Gap Canal working there, and some discharged soldiers, men that were wounded in the service of the U.S. Army and returned home to Roanoke that cannot get any rations and are not able to work. Some soldiers are sick in hospitals that have never been paid a cent, and their families are suffering, and their children going crying without anything to eat. Fourth, our families have no protection. The white soldiers break into our houses, act as they please, steal our chickens, rob our gardens, and if anyone defends themselves against them, they are taken to the guardhouse for it. So our families have no protection when Mr. Streeter is here to protect them and will not do it. Fifth, General, we the soldiers of the 36 U.S. colored troops, having families at Roanoke Island, humbly petition you to favor us by removing Mr. Streeter, the present assistant superintendent at Roanoke Island under Captain James. General, perhaps you think the statements against Mr. Streeter too strong, but we can prove them. General, order Chaplain Green to Washington to report the true state of things at Roanoke Island. Chaplain Green is an assistant superintendent at Roanoke Island with Mr. Howland Streeter, and he can prove the facts. And there are plenty of white men here that can prove them also, and many more things not mentioned. Signed on behalf of humanity, Richard Etheridge, William Benson. So this Streeter guy is a real piece of work. According to historian Robert C. Kinzer in his book, Time Full of Trial, The Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony, quote, the last straw came when Howland Streeter, Horace James' assistant superintendent on the island, was convicted by a military commission for misapplication and embezzlement of property entrusted to his care. Because James came to his assistant's defense, his relationship with the colony would never be the same. End quote. When the war ended in 1865, President Andrew Johnson, who became president after Lincoln was assassinated, he signed the Amnesty Proclamation, which returned all property seized by Union forces during the war to its original owners. Now, a lot of these colonists, these formerly enslaved people, were seized as property initially, right? Contraband. The Emancipation Proclamation put a stop to all of that. So it's not like they're going to be returned to their previous enslavers, but the land that they're living on, that's a different story. The land the colony was built on had been seized by the Union Army from local landowners. And according to the Amnesty Proclamation, now they had to give it back. So this was really the beginning of the end for the colony. They were stripped of their land. They had to leave.
No, but unfortunately, the colony didn't last too long. Within a few years, the government, long story, but the government eventually decides that the land that had been given to the freedmen to build homes on, that land would need to be returned to the whites. So most people who came left. I'm a part of a family that has been here since the beginning. So there are a few scattered families on Roanoke Island that are still here and connected to this history. My family just happens to be one.
Many of them actually went back to the plantations in eastern North Carolina where they had previously been enslaved. They went back and continued to work the land as sharecroppers and tenant farmers. But some of them, around 300 of them, remained on Roanoke Island. An 1870 census reported 300 Black people living in 60 different households on the island. They lived there for generations, and many descendants of the Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony still live on Roanoke Island today, including our very own Joan Collins.
I say this all the time, look and read for yourself too, because there's a lot of information out here. People just don't read or look to find it. The National Park Service here at Fort Raleigh, for instance, recently opened a new trail called the Freedom Trail. I don't know if you've ever been there, but you,
I need to go. I've heard about this. Yeah.
you, yeah, you should, because it's a trail that's right at Fort Raleigh, the location, where the enslaved would have literally crossed the creek, which is the Sound, seeking their freedom. But it's an interesting, it's interesting, and I think thoughtfully done. It's got silhouettes that represent, the people who would have lived on the colony, and the National Park Service has done an incredible amount of research to try to bring those stories to life. So I end up and worked, fairly closely with our organization to get perspectives and that sort of thing. But that's a neat place to go. I would encourage.
That Freedom Trail is set up at Fort Raleigh on the north end of Roanoke Island, which, if you were with me for the Lost Colony episodes 27 and 28, was the location of the fort set up by Ralph Lane and his men in 1585, a different colony entirely. Also, the place where freedom seekers would have crossed the creek to find freedom on Roanoke Island. I love the intertwining of the history on this tiny island, and Joan is really at the center of all of it.
I have a deep roots to this area, roots that are connected to the story of the Freedmen's colony, roots that are connected, you know, that have ties to the Native American history of the area, roots that have ties to the arrival of the English, and, like so many locals do here.
But it does leave me wondering, I know so very much about the 1585 and the 1587 Roanoke colonies, which happened over 400 years ago. Why have I not been taught about the Freedmen's colony from around 150 years ago? I grew up here and I learned about the Lost Colony, and I don't remember learning about the Freedmen's colony. And that's really a shame. So I'm happy to hear that they are, putting things in place to teach people about it
You
finally.
know, and I always tell people this is complex and tough history. It really is. I mean, I think so, but people, I really do I think need to really kind of stop and think about it, because what our past also teaches us, I think, is even how we form our own thinking today. What we're used to experiencing and learning about stays with us. So if there's a part that has been dismissed or not made known, how do you know of that? How do you know of that? And I always tell people that the uh, mission of our organization, the Pea Island Preservation Society, is simply to make this history known, history that quite frankly has been overshadowed. You have said yourself, you've heard of the Lost Colony, you've heard of the Wright brothers, but, people don't have an awareness that this history is also here.
That awareness is so important. This coming Saturday, February 22nd, Joan's organization, the Pea Island Preservation Society, is hosting an event in Manteo to raise that awareness.
February 22nd will be at the College of the Albemarle. It's called PIPC Past, Present, and Future, where we're actually featuring 3 short videos that we've done that, tell the story of Richard Etheridge and the Pea Island Lifesavers and tell about us. And, what we try to do is to do what I call creative storytelling. It's, where we try to tell the story in a little different way. And it is a little different, I think, because there are a couple of us that are descendants, and obviously know this history based on the experiences that our family went through. But we also just try to, do it in a way that gets people to think and is engaging.
That's 3 p.m. at the College of the Albemarle in Manteo this coming Saturday, February 22nd, for all my Outer Banks people who'd like to attend. The Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony was short-lived, but in those few short years, 1862 until it was officially abandoned for the most part in 1867, it was a remarkable thing, a gathering place for freedom seekers who knew if they could just make it to the island, if they could just get over the water and make it to shore, they would find freedom. They would find a community. They would find churches, religion. They would find education. They could learn to read and write. It was a utopia of sorts. And though they suffered and struggled at times, it was something they had never had before. It was the beginnings of a foundation, of something solid on which to build, of freedom. And their legacy lives on Roanoke Island and throughout eastern North Carolina today. The descendants born upon that solid foundation, Joan Collins included. It's significant, and yet most have selectively forgotten all about it. It's time we change that. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting and maybe you even learned something new. Be sure to follow my Instagram at History Fix Podcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen, and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix. Information used in this episode was sourced from Time Full of Trial, the Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony by Robert C. Kinzer, Ironclads and Columbiads by William R. Trotter, the National Park Service, Wikipedia, RoanokeFreedmen'sColony.com, and Roanoke Island Festival Park. As always, links to these sources can be found in the show notes.